Hello, listeners, and welcome to the World Discord Podcast. This is our special post election edition, and we have two wonderful guests today. Our first guest is a professor of political science at Loyola University Chicago, Dr. Brian Endless. Hi, Brian.
Me? I didn't realize
Yeah.
I was going to be guest today. This is so
Oh.
cool. Who's
Who's
our
our
second
second
guest,
guest? Will you
Joel?
introduce the second guest?
Our second guest apparently is Professor Joel Ostro, an eminent professor from Benedictine University. Did I say eminent often enough?
I think you said dumbass. That would have been more
Oh,
accurate.
okay, good. That,
Yeah.
that was good.
Yeah,
Couldn't have
so
been any better guests today, huh?
or worse ones.
Yeah. The topic is something no one wants to touch at the moment, I think.
Given our discussion is the outcome of the election, having the worst possible guests probably fits because we certainly got the worst possible president. um,
Out of the two choices, I think so.
Out of the two choices. Um, so I don't know about you, but my classes today in particular,
Oh, by the
one
way, hang
today
on.
and one yesterday.
Before I continue any further, I should say that if we're going to be at all partisan in this, I am only speaking for myself and not for Loyola University Chicago.
I'm definitely not speaking for Benedictine University. For this, I'm fairly confident.
Excellent.
um, Yeah, so my classes the last couple of days have been pretty heavy with discussion of the consequences of this election, and our discussion today, uh, I guess, will be about what the outcome of the election means for discord around the world.
Yeah.
Um,
People are rightfully freaked out in the combination of knowing what could happen, but also really having no idea of what's going to happen right now. And that's
right.
factors. And one of the issues our allies regularly talk about with Donald Trump is they just don't know what he's going to do. They didn't know when he was president. They don't know what he might do this time as president. Sometimes he says things and never does them. And other times he just makes snap decisions and alliances change as things happen.
And he is a disruptor, like his idol Vladimir Putin. And I'm glad you mentioned that, Alex, because that's really where I was hoping we would start today with the news of the collapse of Germany's government. Um, and ostensibly, it was about over a difference between the prime minister Scholz and his finance minister. But I see underneath that um, the party of the finance minister um, pulling out of the coalition,
Right.
and there are likely to be elections in Germany in the next few months. And um, if history is any lesson, um, we should expect a very strong performance by the far right in Germany. Um,
Yeah, and I don't
because
know all the specifics in terms
oh,
of what their likely percentages are or anything else, but we do know the German prime minister has been seen as a pretty weak prime minister,
mhm.
and it was a pretty weak government, and the things pushed it over the edge. But combination of Ukraine and EU relations, and now this too.
And that's really one thing I've been talking to my classes about is um, yeah, so in one of the classes the topic this week was globalization, and the United States was the major force behind creating this world of international institutions, global trade, intertwining economies and societies together as much as possible, and the idea that that would lead to reduce conflict and other means to resolve differences, um, and a consequence of the U.S. retracting from or withdrawing from some of those commitments will have necessary ripple effects. But one effect that I have noticed was um, as the United States has moved to the right, there has been a rise of the right across Europe. In 2016, Trump won, and we saw far right parties really gain elected office across Europe. There was kind of a pause in that after 2020, and we saw the defeat of a lot of those, or at least reduction in influence of those right wing parties. And then they've started to come back, and I would imagine that a consequence of Trump's victory will be a very strong showing of AfD in Germany, and in future elections of right wing parties across Europe. I wonder what your thought is on.
It's interesting. I hadn't thought of it the way you just put it, but you just put two and two together for me. So a lot of the thinking I've been doing the past 2 days has been domestic. I've been thinking more
Mhm.
than international.
Sure, of
That's
course.
obviously there. And one of the things that I have realized, and I don't think many people are talking about in depth yet, it's starting to come through, is I see this election in the US as a failure of the neoliberal economic system to provide the goods. And what we've got is a significant group of working class people, that bottom 75% and really the bottom 90%, who
My
are not
90.
benefiting from the economy, and bottom 50% enormously not benefiting from the economy, and a tiny percentage are benefiting from it. And that, I think, was an enormous driver behind Trump's victory. He
Yeah.
played to those people, not through their prejudices and things like that, more by just paying attention to them, and them paying attention to the fact that they have legitimate gripes, rent, and affording to be able to live, and affording to be able to eat and feed their families and send their kids to school. Those are
Mhm.
huge things. But one of the things I hadn't quite put together, and I think it's true, is this is also probably going to be happening in other countries. And
Sure.
it's not just that there's a movement to the right, it's that I think we're seeing people who are now in the late stage capitalism, and capitalism has created a tiny number of winners and a gigantic number of increasing losers, and more in the US, I think, than in other industrialized countries, because they have better social safety nets. But even in those countries, there
Yeah.
are a lot of people who are
Oh,
falling behind.
I mean, we've known this for a while, right? Like
Well, we haven't.
inequality.
I don't know that we've seen it. I absolutely, yeah, I
Well,
keep
inequality
up on
across
Trump.
countries and inequality within countries has been expanding since 1980, really, and really
Right.
accelerating since about 1992.
Yeah.
And Joe
But
Stiglitz
what?
and uh, Krugman and Robert Reich have been talking about
Right.
this for decades
What?
now. And neo, I would argue that neoliberalism has gotten a bad name in much the way that democracy in Russia got a bad name. It's really neoclassical liberalism, what's been
Yeah.
practiced, and it has been rules designed to benefit the very few. And
Oh,
so the
it's
outcomes
Reagan.
have
It's
benefited those
Reagan
few.
Thatcherism
Yeah,
is what it amounts to.
yeah,
It is that order that started in the 1980s.
yeah, yeah,
Financialized capitalism, predatory capitalism, are other names for it that are
yeah.
out there. But absolutely, the thing that I think that Trump started to show, and this was a very early response for me in 2016 with Trump, is he started playing to the people who were left behind. And
Yeah, and
this
using
election,
anger to
yeah,
recruit them.
100%. And
Same
he
as in
built.
the late 1920s and early 1930s around the
It's
world.
it's a
Yeah,
standard demagogue tactic,
sure.
and I'm not using demagogue in a necessarily negative way here. It is, but it's just a person who doesn't push to rational ideas. He pushes to feelings. He pushes to people's feelings that everybody else is passing them by, feelings that they used to have it better, and that doesn't
Exactly.
appeal to rational minds. I think that's one of the problems that the liberal parties have, the Dems in the U.S. and others, is the Dems have a failure of imagination when it comes to understanding what bothers people. And I don't think they see it the way Trump did. I give him credit for that he latched on to what bothers people. And he played it. I don't like the way he played it personally, but he played it well enough to win a majority of the popular vote. When's the last time a Republican did that?
So I wonder if we could structure this like if we want to talk about the effects globally,
Yeah,
maybe we start with
absolutely.
Europe, right? So Trump is very clearly, and Vance and this far right that has taken control of the Republican Party, the now extremist Heritage
I call it
Foundation
the MAGA
group.
right as opposed to the far
The-
right. There's too many rights in this country.
yeah, it's pretty extremist though,
Yeah.
but it's clearly. um, if not anti-NATO, um, much less committed to the North
I,
Atlantic Alliance.
I
And if like what I've been saying to my students was, and even on air the other day on the radio on election day was, if I put myself in say President Macron's chair or any European head of state, prime minister's chair, and I look at things, it's like I can't trust the United States' commitment to the North Atlantic Alliance anymore. And it seems to me that Europe has one of two choices: either to formally bring the military under the EU in a European military, or the fragmentation really spins out of control and the EU fails, and you have Germany with a German military, and France with a French military, and Italy with an Italian military, and on and
I
on, and isolationism and competitive
yeah. I
military
certainly
strategic
hope
economics.
I certainly hope your worst case is wrong. I mean, I think we're looking at potential American isolationism. That's one thing that's out there. I think that scares Europe and our allies. I think that the idea of tariffs is incredibly scary to everyone else in the world who remembers the Great Depression apparently much better than we
And
do.
doesn't want another Great Depression. Yeah,
Exactly. And it's
yeah.
the combination isolation and tariffs that leads to exactly that. I do think, though, this is going to be a wake up call to Europe that I hope it's not that they are on their own individually, but I do think that they're going to have to create a European alliance that is NATO, possibly without the US or with the US as a weak partner. And they're going to
Or
have
the
to think
U.S. is
hard
there
about
in name, but it's really a year. Like the
right.
problem, they're going to have to dispense with the consensus decision making. Like and we all have to be in consensus, but it doesn't matter what the United States says.
Right.
Kind of
But
arrangement.
the other side of that is that's a lot of money that's going to have to go on the European side,
Mhm.
and it's a lot of arms production that now, frankly, I think the US military industrial complex will be happy to keep arming the Europeans. I think they're probably the biggest winners out of this election,
Which is
bar
why
none.
they also want to keep arming Ukraine, right? Like
Yep.
that. This has been an economic benefit to the United States that people don't notice, but we
Yeah.
can get to that.
No, 100%. But yeah, I mean, Europe knows they've got to keep propping up Ukraine in one way or another, or it puts
Mhm.
Russia on their doorstep. I'm sure we'll talk about Ukraine more. They've got to keep themselves strong with Putin in Russia. They've got to show strength to the rest of the world. So
Well,
the one way
yeah.
or another, those countries are going to have to pick up the slack, and I think it's going to be painful in a lot of different ways.
I guess there's the third option, which is the one I alluded to at the beginning, which is that um, I, I don't know what you want to call it, authoritarian parties, right wing parties, ascendant across Europe, and then in because Russia then may be less of a threat to them if they are moving away from liberal democracy. Uh, Perhaps
Possibly,
then the
although I think
military
that
spending is
sadly,
less.
I think aren't those parties even more likely to arm at that point in time, and more likely to want to throw away alliances,
Go
and more
that way as
likely to go
well. Mhm.
anti-foreigner? And does that bring back,
And anti-integration. Yeah.
yeah,
Mhm.
does that bring back French Belgian conflicts and
Right. That's
tensions
the doomsday scenario, right?
and tensions with Poland too
Yep.
all over the place. So
Mhm.
that there's a lot of I don't want to go too far into the absolute doomsday other than to say it could be out there because I personally don't see the evidence for it. But we need to consider that if things spin out of control, there's a lot of ground where the U.S. being strong in the NATO alliance is important to keep things stable.
Well, and in the short term, right, the issue is Ukraine, and Europe has been behind the scenes trying to figure out what happens if Trump wins. And I think
Yeah,
there's a despondence about it because Ukraine can't survive. It's not just NATO support. Ukraine can't survive without American
right.
support. I don't believe that Europe can do it, can cover that
No.
without the United States.
Europe actually, I saw a great report on German production capability, which is where a lot would have to come from. They won't have it for about 4 or 5 years, up to a point that they could actually fully arm Ukraine. There's just physically no way. They do not have the military production capacity. The U.S. doesn't have the military production capacity, but we've been building it up, and we've
Mhm.
really been pushing it since Russia invaded, and we're
Right.
far ahead of where Germany and where Europe are in terms of the potential to help them out.
And it could in fact be disagreement about what to do in the wake of termination of U.S. support of Ukraine that splinters Europe apart,
Yeah,
because there will be differences. There's different strategic positions. Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. They're going to feel and the Scandinavian countries are going to fare very
right.
differently than maybe Italy or
Well,
France.
you
Although
you
France
you
has
have
been one of those super supporters, so it's
you have the Russia Ukraine expertise. Let me throw out another one that's been talked about and ask your perspective on it. Is Ukraine forced to the table if the U.S. pushed out, and do they have to give away the Donbas regions in Crimea more formally in order to be able to keep their independence?
I can answer your question with a question. Why would Russia negotiate? What incentive does Russia have to negotiate?
It's a good
What
question.
the intent was to take over all of Ukraine. What
Right.
stopped Russia from, with the U.S. withdrawing and Ukraine unable to rearm and a shortage of manpower? Um, the situation changes dramatically, and I don't
Yeah.
see why, given Putin's objective, it's much, you know, I guess Ukraine ceding the Donbass and Crimea would be as temporary and unreliable a solution as were the Minsk Accords in
Yeah.
2014 when it was
No, well,
clear
I can
what
definitely. I think
Russia's
that one might
intentions
be
were.
more likely. My guess would
That
be
ultimately
that
Russia will
if
take
he
the whole
was
thing over
presented with it, Putin might take it in order to get the secure
to
base in
rearm,
the
give time to
and
rearm
exactly.
and let the young boys grow up to fighting age and then go
Right. No, and
quote
again,
unquote do the
if we
job.
want to look at the horrific possibilities, again, if the U.S. pulls out, some European countries, Germany, France, might decide that they have to really up armaments to Ukraine and start using some of their air force in there. And that could level things out to the point that it could force a stalemate. But that would really, again, potentially escalate things in horrible directions.
And what if Macron's threat, like, was it an empty threat to send French troops to fight in Ukraine? Like, what? It's unfathomable, but it was unfathomable that Donald Trump would ever be president again, right? If you
If
just
I'm,
go
if
back
I
3 years, it
am,
was inconceivable 3 years ago, right? So
if I,
obviously, it can
if
happen.
I'm a French military advisor, I'm not going to want boots on the ground, except I might put an air force on the ground and I might put long range artillery on the ground. And
Might put boots on the ground in Poland.
yeah, and that's entirely possible to support that too. So, I might
Mhm.
do things that can hurt them from a significant distance
Yeah.
and see where it goes from there. Also, I'm kind of curious, and this is just a pie in the sky thought. I'm wondering how many new and different types of drones the major powers of the world have that we haven't seen yet, noting that this is probably the century of drone warfare. I've been giving this a peripheral thought lately. I haven't given it a lot of thought, so consider I'm just kind of throwing this out. But everybody and their sister is using drones. Some drones are a whole lot more powerful than others, and I can't imagine there aren't military contractors that have some pretty advanced drones out there
Oh,
that
for
could
sure.
conceivably be thrown into
Even
this.
Russia unveiled a new one last week. Ukraine's been developing new ones.
Yeah,
We know that the United States, since the Obama administration, has developed much more accurate and reliable drones
right.
than right, because that drew so much criticism, the inaccuracy of the
Yep,
bombing we were doing around Africa to go after Al Qaeda, and you don't hear of mistakes anymore because they don't happen. It doesn't mean that drone strikes haven't happened since the Obama administration. They
right.
have.
Yeah,
They've been much more precise and accurate.
yeah,
So for sure, the United States does. Who knows what other countries?
yeah. So do the Europeans do long range stuff, and they, that could push the stalemate too. That's a
And
possibility.
what is clear is, even if France and Germany don't have a lot of them now, it's quite obvious that they're pretty easy to develop and pretty
Right,
easy to roll out. Ukraine is producing incredibly accurate and high tech drones on its own
right,
over
in a war zone.
while devastated by
Yeah,
war, right? And they are airborne, they are amphibious, and they are land. They have them
right.
land, air, and sea now. Quiet and incredibly uh, powerful,
Yeah,
carrying incredibly powerful explosives. So
yeah.
yeah, it seems to be an easy technology to
Yeah.
develop,
I'm
relatively
really,
easy
honestly, I'm
and
just
cheaper.
sitting here I'm just sitting here waiting for our robot overlords to take over. It'll happen soon enough. That'll
Well,
solve all our
is
problems.
Stephen Miller human or is he robot?
Oh, oh.
Let's
That was
start a
a comment
conspiracy
by
theory from the
Professor Joel Ostro, just in case the tape is being reviewed later. Joe.
left. The views
Hey,
expressed in this
let's
podcast
turn
are
to
strictly my own and not affiliated with any organization or university other than Loyola's.
let's turn to Asia, shall we?
Yeah. Oy, dark
I
humor.
think that Asia is going to be one of the other hotspots. Here's the deal in Asia: if we start backing out, and if we start losing commitments, we get questions. Okay, let's say that we stay anti-China, and arguably we might still protect Taiwan. That's a possibility. But are we still protecting South Korea? Are we still protecting Japan? Do we push one of those two far enough away that they feel a need to develop nuclear weapons? And I think that's a not insignificant question. The Japanese people have still largely are horrified by the possibility. Not all Japanese politicians are. And South Korean politicians, I think, are at the point that if the North has them and they can't rely on Kim Jong Un's love buddy, who's to say exactly what's going to happen here? Hey, no, I'm quoting Trump there. That's they have a love affair,
They have a
according
love
to
affair.
the next president of the United States.
But then again, well, do we know? Does President-elect Trump use an iPhone or does he use a Samsung or Android? Right? I mean, it is hard
I
to
actually thought he doesn't use one. I don't. I honestly think he doesn't use a cell phone.
okay. His aides, are they using iPhones? Are they using
Right, that I don't
Samsung?
know.
But it's a rhetorical question. But it Trump cares about his and his family's wealth,
Yes.
and our stock market, his investments, his Jared's investments, they cannot stand a break with either Japan or South Korea. It would be catastrophic for for everyone, including the Trumps. And I can't imagine that
I hope he has that much foresight. I hope that this is something that he
dementia's a
actually thinks.
dementia's a evil thing.
Well, and
So
a piece of it too is, how much of his money is just in American real estate, and how much of it is really name value as opposed to real estate value, and
mhm,
where does he see his bread buttered? And I don't
it's a good
know what
question.
all those answers are. We don't know where his money is. That's been a problem since 2015 when he was running. We
Yeah,
just have no idea. We should be able to answer these questions in an open democracy, and we ain't an open democracy when it comes to that.
but definitely, yeah. South Korea has to be really worried. I think Japan less so, but I think everyone's worried about the problem of China
Right.
and
I think
conflict.
Japan's concerned because if China destabilizes because of things that the
Correct,
U.S. does, that
correct.
will lead to a potential for additional militarization.
And then you're talking about
That's a
major
problem.
regional problems. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
No,
Um,
absolutely. It's yeah, we've got the potential for a lot of issues, and then you just talk stock market too. That's the other one that's going to have potential for discord and a lot of potential conflict that comes out of it. Oil markets and what happens in the oil markets. Do we go back to pushing up fracking? If we push up fracking, do the Saudis come back again and cut prices and open the spigots to try to get rid of fracking? So there's all sorts of different potential conflicts that various tariffs and other trade policies could lead to here.
And that can all lead to conflict, right? So
Yeah.
let's suppose that he does impose these high tariffs on China, and my guess is it wouldn't just be on China, but even if it's just that, the disruption that causes
Oh, it's huge.
to the global economy is is catastrophic, and it just astounded me, the stock market reaction to the election outcome, because I see a stock market crash if those tariffs are imposed,
Right.
because
I
there's
I
no
think
way
that
it
the
can't
market
be a drag on our economy.
Yeah, I think the market has a little bit too much post-election exuberance, as they often do,
Mm.
and they're kind of in a wait and see on what he'll really do. The stock market has to be wondering. He's surrounding himself this term openly with plutocrats, openly
Right.
surrounding himself with insanely rich advisors.
Yeah.
And is the stock market counting on the fact that those people will stop his worst on the spot indulgences before they happen, or do they end up happening and we start seeing some terrible stuff? 20% tariffs on China alone means China puts tariffs on us,
Right.
means everything in the US costs more and we get less
Right.
trade to China, and our trade to China
Exactly.
is worth less. And everybody's economy starts to go down even more because of it. So
And
it's just
yeah,
horrific.
and as I was explaining to my class today, you impose the tariffs on goods coming from China. So either those goods become more expensive, or we're not importing those things from China and we're producing them here, which, guess what, makes them more expensive.
We can't produce most of them here.
Right.
How long would it take
And
to
well, the
set up a
cost of labor
factory
is
to
higher. That's
produce
why we
it?
moved
Yeah,
production to China in the first place, right? So
exactly.
no matter how you slice it, things become a lot more expensive here.
Right.
Um,
No,
but but
100%.
but the effect um, on markets uh, is global,
Right.
and it affects not just our economy, but it affects, because of the world that the United States created. Right, we led the creation of this international economic order.
Yep.
Kind of at our insistence. We're all bound together. That was by design.
Oh, yeah.
If our economy sinks, everyone else's economy sinks. And we know from past experience of what happens in the world when there is global economic trauma. It
And to
leads to
develop
global conflict.
and the developing countries have had major hits, especially the poorest one from oil crises, from
Right.
COVID, now from wheat and fertilizer out of Ukraine and Russia. And they
Yeah.
haven't recovered from those yet. And they take more hits. That's going to lead to more conflict in developing countries too, which is going to screw trade more and
Yeah.
screw everyone across the globe more, including harming the people there.
I see the same thing with immigration policy.
Yeah,
Because if
no,
the
100%.
United, the country with the Statue of Liberty that has always been the land for immigrants and shown the economic benefit of immigration, if we close off, um, remember when Trump was in the first time, Europe, in response to the refugee crises, put up their walls.
Right.
Um, Again, we were kind of the impetus for that. But now, if it happens, as the effects of the fake hoax of climate change take effect, you, right, climate migration is a thing, and it's only going to increase. And if borders are
Incredibly,
closed,
probably in the next 4 years.
you have another axis of potential hostility and conflict, right?
Right.
Of
And that drives, taking us back full circle, that drives the move to the right and the move
right.
to isolation in
Mhm.
industrialized countries, in the northern
Mhm.
industrialized countries. And frankly, it's going to drive isolation in smaller countries too, because if the north can't take them in, they're going to get stuck in transit countries in the south, and those
Yeah,
southern countries are going to get overburdened and they're
and
not going to be able to handle it.
right. And then you have conflict there as well, right? It's just
Joel, you're
hard to see
depressing
it.
me. We're
Yeah, I had a
depressing.
really happy discussion in class today, let me tell you.
Yeah.
Um,
Let's go to one more here, and we can go wherever else we want afterwards. But elephant in the election and in the room is Israel and Palestine.
there's no
And
conflict there.
no, 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 there's not
None at
going to
all.
be,
Yeah,
because I
right.
think Trump has made it incredibly clear that he is not just on Israel's side, but he's on Bibi Netanyahu's side, because there are a lot of groups in Israel who could go in a lot of directions, but
And we
Trump's
know how
not.
Trump feels about Muslims.
Exactly. He's not in favor of a two-state solution. He's anti-Muslim. He is anti-Palestinian. The Israelis have already effectively been doing what they want to in both Gaza and in Lebanon. Trump may push them harder or allow them more reign on
Yup.
Iran. And we're looking at, maybe more conflict with Iran, but frankly, I think we might just be looking at the Israelis getting the worst elements of the Israelis, because I don't blame the Israeli people for this or the state of Israel. It's a leadership thing. The worst elements of the Israeli leadership getting cut loose to do whatever they want to.
And what's going to happen is, right, we'll stop employing Americans to build weapons and pay for them and send them to Ukraine. They'll still employ Americans and build weapons, and they'll all go to Israel now.
Yeah, although I think the weapons will still get to Ukraine. We'll just be selling them to the Europeans who'll send them to Ukraine. So I don't think the military industrial complex is going to let that tap close. They're going to push too hard to keep being able to sell stuff over there and get stuff into that war. Maybe it'll be behind the scenes a little bit more. But you're
Unless
absolutely right.
unless
More
it
is going
shifts
to,
to Israel,
yeah,
right?
more is going to go to
They
Israel.
because the producers, they don't care where it's going as long as they're
Yeah,
making money, right?
yeah. Well, they can make more
Um,
money if it goes to both of them.
can I, because you're more tuned into the Middle East situation than I am, but I do pay attention to it quite a bit. Um, the Biden administration has taken uh, justifiable criticism for um, I don't want to use the word enabling, but not opposing enough
Yeah,
Israel's the atrocities committed by Israel in Gaza. But at the same time, my argument has been that no administration has ever put as much pressure on Israel as the Biden administration, and no administration has done more to try to advance the cause of Palestinian statehood through the diplomacy. And the scenario I presented after class to a group of my Muslim students, a couple of whom are Palestinian Americans, was to try to look uh, at a historical example and a lost opportunity uh, and a failure of the Harris campaign, I think, in its communication. And it's as follows. Um, After centuries upon centuries of being evicted from one country and another with mass persecution and executions um, and other, although the word didn't exist, genocidal activities over the centuries, then came the catastrophe. And this myth, which really was a myth over the centuries, uh, the uh, the Passover prayer next year in Jerusalem.
right,
Um, at the end of the catastrophe, the state of Israel was created, and there was a homeland for the Jewish people.
right.
There have been, however long you want to say, but certainly decades, but it's longer than decades of persecution, oppression, and catastrophe. Now, catastrophe for the Palestinian people, really not just Gaza, but it's been a long period
Oh
of
yeah,
unspeakable crimes in the settlements committed by Israel. That at the end of this, it seemed the opportunity was there for a Palestinian state, and that the United States and our allies, and it's a broader alliance this time that includes states in the region, the Saudis,
right.
Jordanians, and others, but still we would be the backbone of guaranteeing not just the security and safety of the state of Israel, but the security and safety of the Palestinian state. And that what Harris, it seems the failure of her campaign to me was almost a fear of angering either community, even though she came out very early calling for a ceasefire. I think it was back in February when she sort of stepped out of the administration and publicly called for it. And she did strongly commit to an independent Palestinian state, but she didn't message it during the campaign enough. Instead, she could have won both communities by forcefully saying, I am committed to security and safety for the Palestinian people in an independent state of Palestine, and our commitment to the safety and security for the state of Israel will also never waver. But the only solution to peace is security and safety for all and statehood for both, with the United States backing that with the coalition we put together. I think she, for whatever reason, that message never happened. And I think
Right.
that was what was needed from the start. I don't know. I
They
just
they
your perspective on all of that. Do you think I'm off in terms of? But I think the idea of a Palestinian state has never been further away than it is now.
Right. So it definitely agree. The idea has never been further away than it is now. I am incredibly fearful for
Yes.
the Palestinian people, much more so this week, since this week than I was the week before.
If people think
Uh,
genocide was happening before, like I think it's
yeah,
unequivocal that the possibility of
it's
actual genocide is
it
there.
is possible that, yeah, there just won't be any Palestinian presence other than a few people who have a foreign government over them in Gaza. It's
Yep.
hard to see that
And maybe
anything
the
else,
West Bank
you
as
know,
well.
and the West Bank is going to get worse. It's and
Yep.
I'm not saying worse before it's going to get better. I'm saying the West Bank is going to get worse.
Going to get worse.
So I just think that Israel has been cut loose at this point. That
Yep.
any leash it had was off.
That's right.
I don't know how good the U.S. leash was. I frankly think that an enormous amount of this still goes back to Netanyahu and the fact that he had such a personal stake in keeping a war going.
Yep.
And
For sure.
that, after setting up Hamas, Hamas did the attack, and that let Netanyahu get into a position where he could have a perpetual war. If he can get both Gaza and the Lebanon situations and possibly hurt Iran at the same time, Teflon Bibi may come out and may actually still end up surviving this. And I honestly think we need to look at that when we look at Israel's goals. It's his personal goal,
Yep.
sadly, for the Israeli people as well as the Palestinian people. Could your idea have worked? Possibly. I don't know whether there was a space to do it, because the debate picked up so much under Biden, and the protest picked up so much under Biden, and people started to go into opposing Israel Palestine camps inside the United States. We've talked on here several times when we had a
Yep.
few people on here, but we were one of the rare voices that looked at both sides, that looked at the middle, that looked at the possibility of both. There were certainly others
Mhm.
out there, but they weren't very common in the press,
That's what
and
I'm
they
saying.
weren't.
That was Harris's opportunity to say something different, and she didn't.
I don't know that it was a real opportunity. I think Harris's problem was she had the combination of the Palestinian groups in swing states like Michigan on one side, pro groups, and then maybe possibly her, including her personal desire to do the right thing on it. But then also she had APAC, the hardcore pro-Israeli groups, and the military-industrial complex on the other side. And I don't know that she had the room, if she was going to win the election, to do something other than stay largely quiet. And that in some ways ended up costing her the
But
election.
it
She had a
cost her. It
connection
cost
with
her is
Julia.
both Jews and Muslims, because then her position is just Biden because she's not articulating anything different.
Right.
Yeah, it would have been a risk, but we've known for a while that she was vulnerable on. I don't even want to call it left right because I don't understand. I understand
It's not a left
Muslim
right.
population's anger at what has happened, but the thinking that a Trump presidency is somehow better is completely defies logic, and that was her opportunity to do something different.
Right.
And
And I made that argument a lot of times that there's no way Trump would be better. People seem to want to punish the Democratic Party. I don't know that we saw that much of that in the end. There were so many other factors that went into the loss. I don't know how big that one. The uncommitted people started backing off and talking about voting for her at the end. So we'll have to look at some after analysis to see. I think she was between a rock and a hard place. One of the
yeah,
things I would bet her advisors did not want, they didn't want her to make Israel Palestine a significant point. They didn't want that to have to come out in discussions and debates because it's too easy an attack point for the Republicans. And the mouthpieces on the Republican side, if she even came out as neutral, would start attacking her as anti Israel. And I think that was a big piece of what she was trying to avoid on that one. And I mean, the interesting thing on the Republican side, they've got the traditional pro-Israeli plus the evangelical
mm.
pro-Israeli that all came together to be a very strong pro-Israeli bloc on that side too. And to me, I think it's very sad. She was damned if she does, damned if she doesn't, no matter where she goes. I think it was a terrible choice to have to make.
And just as this is almost certain catastrophe for Palestine, we agree on that. It is well within the realm of possibility that this will also be catastrophic for Israel.
Oh, 100%. To me, what all Israel is doing right now is creating generations of terrorists who
Yup,
have wonderful cause to go after Israeli
yup,
citizens. That they
yup.
have given them cause to go after them. This has put Israeli relations with other Arab countries on a back burner for at least years, depending on how bad this
And
goes.
in a weird way, the potential for the US to be a restraining influence on that has also been squandered.
Yeah,
Because with the Palestinian state, we have much more influence
right,
across the whole region, especially if we are the guarantor of their economic viability and their security.
right.
Uh,
No, I
and
completely agree.
yeah,
Because the Arab
really
people aren't going to let their leaders make a deal. The Saudi leaders, MBS may still want to make a deal tomorrow, but his people aren't going to let him
not going
make a
to be
deal. No
happy.
matter how much of a dictator
Uh,
you are, you're not
right.
going to be able to move forward after that.
Yeah, and if you try to, then the internal consequences become
Oh yeah,
uh,
they become
so
huge.
serious that you know um, the world's a gloomier place after Tuesday, Brian.
It is. No, there is. I don't know of any international places where this is a bright spot. I'm not sure that, other than for
That was my
Israel and
next
Putin.
question for you.
Yeah, but for Russia and Israel, for Putin and Netanyahu in particular as individuals, they were certainly cheering this on. For a few other authoritarians in Eastern Europe, they're cheering this on. But beyond that, I'm not sure what the bright spots are.
Unless there are states that benefit from American emigration uh, to, escaping out to somewhere that might be, quiet and like maybe New Zealand benefits somehow, or I don't know,
Yeah.
Mexico,
New
Costa
Zealand
Rica,
could
I
have
don't know.
all the climate refugees coming in. So,
Yeah, yeah. No, but you're right.
um,
Like, what part of the world benefits from this outcome? I hadn't really
I don't
asked myself that
I
question
don't know
before.
anyone because trade relations,
Russia,
even with our
maybe
allies,
Russia
Russia,
benefit.
And Israeli right wing leadership, not Israel necessarily, but Israeli right wing leadership. The biggest part of the world that benefits is the military industrial complex
Yeah,
and billionaires writ large.
and they were doing
And
fine anyway,
yeah, yeah,
right?
absolutely. But
Uh,
no, country wise, people wise, I don't see people anywhere on the international scene, either in an economic or political or military sense, benefiting from this. And that's sad.
One thing I sort of hesitate to ask,
Are we going to have to
but
cut this out?
we have talked about internal conflicts in other countries
Right.
on this podcast. Um, and those who join the United States military pledge an oath to the Constitution. what is the potential uh, for members of the military here um, abiding by that oath if
So
push comes to shove?
I will say, we need a good friend of ours who we won't name, who's an expert on civil military relations, to potentially help us with this one.
Okay.
I think, I think that person's initial answer is going to be near zero, and I agree. In 2020, the answer was zero, and or zero in any place of leadership that would push people to do it. There are certainly soldiers who might have issues, but nobody in the leadership structure at any level who would help out. This is one of the fears that I have about Project 2025, and it's the thing that is scariest to me about this whole question. Donald Trump has flat out said he wants to use the military inside the
Yeah.
country.
Yeah.
In 2020, it was largely unthinkable that the
But the National
military,
Guard was deployed.
but they're supposed to be used inside the country.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's a
Yeah.
different story. The military itself,
Mhm.
in 2020, it was largely unthinkable that that could have happened. It just wasn't going to happen. The question is the administration now going to be in a position to put its own people in places of leadership in the
Right.
military? That's what an authoritarian would want to do.
Right.
I've seen no evidence of that other than the fact that Trump says he wants to do it, and
Mhm.
Project 2025 has set up plans for doing it.
To do
So
it.
this is not pie in the sky. This is
Right, and that's why
absolutely
I'm asking about the pushback
right.
from
I
other
think the
leaders in
push.
the the
I think the
reason I
pushback
ask.
would be enormous. I don't think it would be small. The
Mhm.
question on the pushback is: are those people then pushed to retire, and do they? And that's kind of the thing that I don't think we know, and I don't think we have enough information about at this point in time.
Because some of those who have issued before election day the most stark warnings against electing Trump were, I mean, unprecedented in American history.
Yeah,
Recent chairmen of the Joint Chiefs of
yeah,
Staff, secretaries of defense,
yeah.
and chiefs of all of the branches, Army, Navy, Air Force,
I
and Marines,
let me
and
make a different prediction. I don't
yeah,
want to go to the point, and I don't think we should. I'm going to argue we shouldn't start discussing the reality of this. My prediction is we are sadly and horribly going to hear a lot about this.
yep,
We are not the first to have talked about it. You're listing
nope,
people who talked about it in the past 2 months,
yep,
and we will not be the last to talk about it. There will be high ranking former military officers noting that current military officers cannot speak in their capacities about it. There will be high ranking former military officers who have an enormous amount to say about this.
hmm,
And I'm sad that we are at a point that we need to have those conversations.
and I think the spark will be um, right the obvious ones if there are demonstrations in the streets about suppose Congress um, passes a national abortion ban, which is a Republican Congress where there is no filibuster. It's
Right.
quite conceivable.
Yeah.
And then people go into the streets. If a President Trump tries to order the military into the streets, then what is the response? That's kind of the scenario I wonder about,
Yeah.
and it's
I'm
really
gonna
dangerous
suggest
in that
I'm
sense.
going to suggest we leave it at that because
Yeah,
we are probably getting too hypothetical
yeah, yeah,
to get any facts on it. And I
yeah,
mean, I think that's a scenario I would love to hear some of the former generals talk about what the current generals might do,
yeah,
and what might happen in
yeah,
that situation.
yeah, yeah.
So
And maybe a future podcast episode.
yeah. And by the
Yeah.
way, for people in the next administration, once again, that's JOEL.
No, 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 no,
Or
no, no, no. It's
yes,
ENDL.
yes, yes.
Hey, you're the one who publishes all this, like you what capitalism and what's your course called? Capitalism and its discontents. Hey, you
I,
don't see that from me.
I started this thing off by congratulating President Trump for picking the people that were going to win him the election. So,
Yeah, exactly. On that happy note.
yeah. We are sadly probably going to have even more to talk about on this podcast in the near and far future.
Probably. Thank you for tuning in. And until next time.
Thank you all. We'll see you next time. Thanks for listening.